Welcome to the Daily Bolster. Each day we welcome transformational executives to share their real-world experiences and practical advice about scaling yourself, your team, and your business.
Welcome to the Daily Bolster. I'm Matt Blumberg, co-founder and CEO of Bolster, and today we are going in deep with Greg Sands. Greg is the founder and managing director of Costanoa Venture Capital in California. He is someone that I have known and worked closely with for over 20 years, both on the Return Path board and here at Bolster. Greg, welcome to the Daily Bolster.
Thrilled to be here.
One of my favorite stories about you is that you were, I believe, the first non-engineering team member at Netscape. And that is the correct characterization?
Yes, I was the first to be hired. There were a couple that were hired after me, but started before me, if you want to be really specific.
First to be hired, 1994, dawn of the commercial internet, not even the pre-dawn of the commercial internet. Probably half the people watching this don't even know what Netscape was. But Netscape was brought the browser to the world. And, Mark Andreessen invented, what was it called? Mosaic, and turned it into Netscape. And, I would love to hear reflecting on 28 years, 29 years, and all that's happened to the world because of the internet, because of browser number one and everything that came from it. Like, how do you sort of think about that piece of your experience in the rearview mirror? And you have to tell a good story about Mark or Ben or Jim Barksdale or Jim Clark or something.
Sure. So I will say, so I don't think about it that often, but it's unequivocally the foundation on which my career has been built, right? It was a launching pad for sure. I think we knew that we were in an extraordinary place at an extraordinary time. So I was the first person hired, and on my third day of work, we showed up on the cover of Time magazine. No, maybe of Fortune magazine is the coolest company in the country. 14 months later, we were public with a $8 billion market cap, having done $80 million in the first year of revenue. So it was quite something. There were, of course, no online stock trading applications at the time because we were barely selling books. But using the phone at Charles Schwab was the low-cost way to buy and sell stocks. And if you dialed the 800 number on that day, it said, "Welcome to Charles Schwab. For the Netscape IPO, press 1." It was so dominated everything that was happening. It was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
But I would say it is. There are moments of extraordinary things happening in the technology industry, and there are times when you know you're in one of them, and there are times when you think you might be, but you're not, and there are times where one might not necessarily know that it's as foundational a period. And it does usually take 2 to 5 years to figure that out. And so to me, one of the most interesting things is having been part of something that was so foundational, so explosive, so out of the ordinary. And then with that lens, trying when, for example, the large language models and ChatGPT comes out, is this one absolutely foundational moments, or is it not? Right? Was the iPhone, was it one of those absolutely foundational moments, or was it not? You and I are old enough to remember that there was a moment where people thought push technology was that foundational.
Right.
And Pointcast hit the earth about 12 months later.
Yeah, Pointcast with the ultimate solution looking for a problem, right?
Exactly.
So you have to have a good Mark Andreessen story. You probably have hundreds of them. But one from like early Netscape, not A16Z, not everything he's become. What was it like working with him when he was 23 and inventing something that changed the world?
Well, okay, there are probably two that are that show up. I'll do them quickly. One is Mark's office was stacks and stacks of paper. I don't even know what the stacks of paper were. And then where there wasn't paper, there were boxes of honeycombs. And when we were, the company was formed as Mosaic Communications. There was the beginnings of us saber rattling on a intellectual property or trademark lawsuit on Mosaic in particular. We had been trying to come up with a name originally just for the browser product. And I'd run brainstorming sessions with the engineering team and the like, and nothing was working. And at some point, the late Mike Homer and Jim Clark and Mark walked by and grabbed me and pulled me into Mark's office. And they said, okay, the trademark thing is real. We have to do something. And we've been thinking about it. We've been working on it. And it literally just, popped into my brain. This is the way you see the net. How about Netscape? And everyone, after all this stress, looked around, they're like, yeah, that's pretty good. That's probably it. And we all walked out. So that's one. I think the other, I saw a picture recently. One of the Netscape founders had forwarded to me a picture of a group of us in Jim Clark's swimming pool, which would have been the summer of 1994. The company was less than 2 months old. And Mark really wanted to throw John Doerr in Jim Clark's swimming pool. And I was the person he roped into doing it. So at a moment when John Doerr was unequivocally the best venture capital investor in the world, and Mark was 23 and I was, 29 or something, we went over and we picked up John Doerr and we threw him into Jim Clark's pool, and we lived to tell about it.
You did. That is impressive. That one I haven't heard. I'd heard about the naming, but I'd never heard that one before. All right, and then my last Netscape question, Jim Barksdale, famous for saying after saying after saying after saying, I have 10 of them running through my head. What's your favorite one?
I think my favorite one is when a bear fights an alligator, who wins depends on the terrain, which means you got to pick the terrain, right? If you're the startup, you're going against the giant, picking the terrain, picking the battle is as important as anything else.
I've actually never heard that one before. That is great. When a bear fights an alligator, who wins depends on the terrain. Okay. All right, let's fast forward. You joined Sutter Hill as associate or senior associate or principal. You get up through the ranks. You're a partner. You're investing. You're at one of the most venerable firms on Sand Hill Road. You have a great portfolio. And then you leave and start a new venture capital firm from scratch. You leave it all behind. What was the spark? And I know you're close with the guys at Sutter. I knew all of them, tremendous, high quality people.
Good human beings.
Great
Absolutely.
human beings. Yeah. So what was the spark? And let's start with that.
To me, the big thing was seeing that the landscape had changed, and that the easy way to say it is, with the rise of cloud computing, it had gotten easier and less expensive to start a business than ever. The response of the major venture capital firms was to increase themselves 4 or 5x in size. So in 98, 99, 2000, every firm that you think of was a $300 or $400 million early stage fund with only one strategy in a stage fund, right? Now, many of them, raise $5 billion a year. And so that mismatch between what the market needed and what the big firms were doing is the one that created the opportunity. The thing that was clear is that there had been an early group of seed funds, but the seed funds were mainly B2C, focused on Internet 2.0 companies. They were mainly what I call, Johnny Appleseed. It isn't a bad strategy, but it isn't my preferred strategy. And so the idea that in the enterprise environment, doing foundational, old school, value added, early stage, concentrated investing, it wasn't being done. And so that to me was the fundamental spark and the reason to go do something different.
And by the way, you and your firm have stayed true to that focus through now 12 years, 10 years, 10 plus. So talk a little bit about how you started the firm and how you kind of, I remember you and I were sitting at lunch at Fiesta Del Mar, and you told me you were spinning yourself out. And I was like, what the hell is he talking about? And to this day, I've never heard of a venture firm created in the manner in which you created Costanoa. So I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. So I was fortunate to be able to take portions of Sutter Hill's ownership in a handful of companies, including Return Path and Intact and Data Logics and Demand Base. Those were all places where I had led the investment, and I think and basically used that as the seed corn for Costanoa, to be able to say to LPs, look, here is an example of my work. We get to benefit from some of it mid-stage, and then we're going to go do a bunch new. And the most important thing is that I was able to do it in part because of my relationship with the Sutter Hill folks, and in part because of the principles of the firm that really continue to inform the way I work, which is you eat what you kill, you communicate directly, you act honorably in every circumstance, and you aim for win-win. And if you do those things, lots of things get easier. And so in this case, look, I had a bunch of economic interests in the funds, and I said, what I really want is to have more of the stuff that I've done. I'm willing to eat what I kill. I'm happy to do it in a way that is win-win, that works for everybody. And as a result, one of the partners, the esteemed Jim Gaither, and I sat down in a room, and he said, don't negotiate with me, and don't lawyer up, like literally do not hire a lawyer. But if you and I can work this out, I'll go to bat and I'll make this happen for you. And the whole agreement was on 2 sheets of paper. It was ratified by a common lawyer who was the firm's counsel, but I had developed trust in.
Yep.
And with that, I was able to walk off into the world and, raise a substantial first fund to create Costanoa as we know it today.
That says so much about the culture and values at Sutter Hill. Obviously yours, but so much that you were able to do that on essentially a handshake, a lightly papered handshake.
Absolutely right. No, as a result, I have great respect for Sutter Hill. In fact, what they've done even subsequent to my departure is more impressive than what they've done before. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary, but also have tried to make sure that those principles show up in our work, including, and most importantly, they show up in our work with founders. Mm-hmm. What we want to be is to be someone who is trusted enough, both by integrity, but also by judgment and trust in transparent communications, that we can be a person in the boardroom where people can be uncertain or share bad news, in spite of the fact that we are an investor.
Right. And actually, that was going to be my question. So most venture capitalists are not founders, right? They work at a firm. Some of them, obviously, someone had to start the firm at some point, but the overwhelming majority of people who are investors and board members from VCs are not founders, and you are. And the question is, how does that change the way you like to show up? Either in a boardroom or even just sitting with the founder.
It has affected the way that I work and invest for sure. I think it is important to say it has, to some extent, always been the case that I think of it as a relationship business, that what you and I have been able to do, and Rob Reed and I were able to do, and Doug Valenti at Quinn Street and I were able to do, is what I'm doing now with Satyen Sangani at Elation, for example, right? But layered on top of that is that it's made me much more empathetic for founders. And so the fact starting something is hard, being ultimately responsible for it is hard, raising money is hard every time, but it's especially hard the first time. And so with that, I think what the, empathy for that has led me to do is, one, to be faster and clearer and more direct with founders during their fundraising processes.
By the way, huge, right? Absolutely huge to be able to be fast and direct, even if the answer is no, especially if the answer is no.
And right, so I've gotten way better at that. I think as a board member, I have gotten more direct. It's very, I think by instinct, I'm a diplomat. I am optimistic and therefore, want to encourage founders and management teams to have success, but they also benefit from hearing what I actually think. And so I've come up with ways to take the edge off of it, but still say, hey, look, that doesn't quite compute. Those pieces don't add up. And, let's take it offline and go work on it. But I'm not sure that this is the plan that you ultimately want to end up with. Those, I think, are the two biggest things that have affected how I work with founders. Now, it's also the case that being ultimately responsible and being the person who's got to lead the firm has meant I actually I say no to many more things before I take a meeting.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You
have to. All right. So let me ask you the flip of that question. How has working with all these founders and CEOs over the years influenced the way you run the firm? Right. Venture capital firms not known for being well-run organizations. Not that they're not good investors, but they typically don't invest much in their own infrastructure.
Yes. I think it's fair to say that most venture firms are very poorly run as organizations, not even necessarily as businesses, but as organizations. And so I think that for me, the big thing is that the thing about being the person in charge, being the founder, and it's been true for you as CEO, is you have to make all of the decisions and they have to work together, right? So as the landscape changes around you need to make all of these subtle decisions. And so, in the venture capital case, the question of, which sectors, which stages, which themes, what check size, what ownership level, what entry point, what people, what process, what fund size, like all of those go together. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the places where we actually get a great deal of credit from our LPs is that all of those things make sense. They evolve a bit every year as the landscape changes and we learn new things, but then they make sense the next year too, because we've tied the pieces of them together. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the strategy part of it. That's easy. And then the question is, how do you actually manage the organization and, hire and develop the people and manage the process in order to achieve that? And I think, honestly, I look at us and I think, we are somewhere between competently run to pretty darn well run organization in terms of how those mechanics work. We tolerate a little bit of chaos. We use a little bit of process. And the average venture firm is incredibly poorly run. And there's an awful lot of, wasted energy. There's a lot of politics and conflict. There are a lot of places where people are out managing their own careers rather than doing what's best for the firm or doing what's best for the portfolio companies. And that stuff is just not tolerated here.
Is there a firm you look to as the gold standard? You're like, yeah, like you say, you're moderately well run, decent. Like, is there one you're like, wow, I aspire to be like X, or is there no X?
There is no X.
There is no X. Maybe Costanoa is the X.
Well, when I say there's no X, I don't know definitively that there isn't somebody who's really
right. There's no one that's well known for it.
That's right. And it's very hard to see inside of other firms. There are a small handful of places where you've got a close enough relationship that you actually get a real answer to that rather than a bunch of chest thumping, which is not useful at all. But I'll also say, if you look at the, if one were to posit that, Bessemer or Andreessen or Sequoia is really well run, they're operating on a scale which isn't relevant to what we're doing, and it isn't relevant to our strategy, right? By definition of fund size, they're doing something that, look, it's just go big or go home every day for every company at all times. Right. And it's just not the way we have to run. Right. So we really had to make it up ourselves. And we have, the thing that I think has been helpful is to basically take the basics of a growth mindset and say, okay, nobody knows exactly how to do this. So we're going to sketch it out. We're going to come up with a theory. We're going to put it in practice. And then we're just going to keep getting better every day.
Yeah. Look, when you have $5 billion under management, the management fees alone give you plenty of infrastructure to play with. So it is a different game.
Yeah. Well, and by the way, that's, half of what Andreessen raised last year.
Right.
AUM is 5 or 10 times that.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the companies that you've invested in and the CEOs that you've backed. And when you think about some of your most successful investments, right? You talked about Rob Reed from Intact, Satyen at Elation, obviously still a work in progress there. Maybe Doug Valenti. What are the things that those CEOs have in common that drove scaled success? Like, not just success, like, hey, I built something, it was a single, it was fine. But what are the things that those CEOs have in common that drove that, not necessarily hyper growth, because a lot of B2B companies don't know what hyper growth is, right? It's like slow, steady progress. But what drove that success?
Mm-hmm. And by the way, in B2B environment, I think, you can have, excellent growth. You can have 100% growth, sometimes even at scale. But you're not going to have the Facebook moment,
right?
Or, or the like, where you've just got a trend that takes over the country and in one fell swoop. I think there are, I'll talk about my own pattern that I've observed, because I think it sometimes is, a little different. The number one is just drive and tenacity. And many investors will say passion, and I actually quite dislike that word because Adam Newman has passion, right? But you got to show up every morning. You got to keep your feet moving. You got to grind it out when it gets hard. And it's always going to be a time when it's hard. And so the drive and tenacity to me is thing number one that I see and that I'm looking for. The second is I'll phrase it as intellectual curiosity, but it's they have to be deeply interested in the customer, and it's not because they necessarily grew up thinking about this customer, but they got to care enough that they're trying to solve the problem, and as they're seeing as it evolves different facets of the problem, and they care and they want to know and the like. Now that also shows up in terms of building the organization, and I'll quote Satyen Sangani from Elation in this. It's been 4 years ago, but I remember him coming to me in probably December of 2019, and he said to me, "I think I finally mastered being the CEO that the company needed in 2019." And I realized going into 2020 that it needs a completely different CEO. It needs something completely different from me. And I'm going to have to shed all of that and molt into a new person.
By the way, he didn't even realize there was a pandemic coming at that point. So
Truly, right?
yeah, everyone needed to be a different CEO in 2020, and no one knew it.
But, look, the people who can build things of scale are, if you think about the classic hero's journey, they are transformed by the process. They have to be signed up to the personal transformation that it takes to be the CEO and the leader that the company needs as it grows. And then the last thing that I'll say is they need to be system builders, right? We talked about this a little bit before in the context of me leading Costanoa, and this is frankly not a very complex organism, and it's not managing it at very big scale. But the organizations and functions break every 18 months if you're continuing to grow. The market landscape changes around you, and you've got to reorient. But that level of constant observation of the market and the company as machinery, and the constant tinkering to get it right and to keep improving is the thing that I've seen make the difference between people that make the turn and people that don't make the turn.
Yeah, that's very well said. Let's pivot to boards. And this will probably be our last topic, although I have a couple different questions around boards. So kind of the same question, or the parallel question to the CEO question. When you think about the best boards that you've been on, which might be those same companies and might not be those same companies, what makes them great? Or the flip, when you think about the worst boards you've been on, what makes them problematic?
Yeah.
What's the difference?
It's interesting. I would say some of those companies, and we'd say the same thing about Return Path. I think I have time and time again been on boards where not just the CEO, but the other earliest investors look around and say, this has been an extraordinary experience and is the seminal experience of my professional life. And that happens because of great people. And when I say great people, it's not because they're the smartest. It's because they show up having read the board book. They've been thinking about the company in between board meetings. They have an interesting combination of judgment and insight. There are some people who are the glue people, the wisdom that ties it together. I probably fall more into that category. There are some people who are the sparks of unusual insight. We worked with Fred Wilson and Brad Feld at Return Path, and both of those are probably in that category. And then they communicate well. And in communicating well, I mean, are direct and clear about what they think. They don't take up too much airtime, and they don't pick unnecessary fights or have to win every battle. It doesn't take extraordinary to be a great board member, but it really is one where I'd say, blocking and tackling really well and being dedicated to blocking and tackling is most of what it takes. Now, what are the worst boards? The worst boards are with, look, it's the caricature of venture capital board members. Don't, show up later, don't show up, aren't paying attention, haven't read the board book.
They're like doing email the whole time. By the way, it's Chat GPT as board member, right? Never often wrong, but never in doubt. At least I know now we have our poll quote from this one. Yeah, often wrong, but never in doubt.
Yeah. And I think it is the case that, board members, investor board members who are often early in their careers, or often don't really come from working inside companies, I think don't quite know how hard it is to actually make things change inside an organization. So they'll show up 30 days later or 60 days later and say, Matt,
Why
we
isn't it
talked about
done?
this. Why haven't you done it?
Right.
And yet there's all of this machinery that actually needs to be moved, and people and role scope and the like. And so I do think that just having some empathy for how hard the job of startup CEO is makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's for sure. All right, so last question about boards that I've been thinking a lot about lately is kind of, the future of the venture-backed board, or the future of venture-backed board meetings. And so, if we wind the clock back 5 years, you're in California, Return Path was based in New York. You got on a plane a few times a year to come to New York for a board meeting. We had a board dinner, we had a drinks thing with the team, we do half a day meeting, maybe you'd tack on another meeting or two in New York, you'd fly back to California. It's, heavy lift. Worth every minute of it, I'm sure, but heavy lift. But that's how all board meetings were. And, firms concentrated their investments in specific places, or they had multiple offices so they could do that. The pandemic obviously broke that, right? For 2 years, everything was shorter and on Zoom, and probably companies were the worst for it. And maybe things are moving into some kind of hybrid mode right now, but sort of how do you think about that? And I guess the fine point I'll put on the question is, I know for partners at a venture capital firm, one of the big limiters is how many boards you can sit on, right? How many of your investment capacity and your capacity to be a productive advisor to a CEO is limited. And did the pandemic change that? Like, now everyone's capacity is up 50% to 100% because you don't have to fly across the country, and meetings are shorter and on Zoom. Is that healthy? Is it not healthy? And where's that all going?
It is definitively the single biggest limiter on venture capital activity. I think it is right to say it is so much more efficient that many board meetings will be remote. Companies will say, oh, we'll have one or maybe two board meetings a year that are face-to-face, where we'll do a board dinner, and
which may be enough. That may be enough to do a couple. Yeah.
It is, I think, like in other work contexts, I'd say it's way more efficient and not quite as good. But it's twice as efficient and 20% less good. So you kind of have to do it.
Yeah.
I think so for sure the pandemic was a catalyst for it, but so were zero interest rates, right? In the end, so many VCs are deal junkies. Their whole thing is they're just hunting. They're just hunting the next deal. They may show up for a board meeting, they may not, but they're just hunters. The zero interest rates and the explosion of fund sizes. So what I observed 11 or 12 years ago is now metastasized.
Right.
So that, again, can I deploy all the capital the firm wants me to deploy is the question. And therefore, the board meetings are they're the tail that's getting dragged around. So I am, what we pride ourselves on trying to be the foundational board member in and around the company, to have the time to work with the company and know it well, to be trusted enough to be the first call, and to have enough capital to stay with the company over time, so we don't abandon ship 2 years later.
Right.
Now, the consequence of that is that's a design decision. It's a strategic decision. It drives limits on fund size, but it takes a choice to do that, and very few people are choosing to do it. And so to me, the real question is, does the reduction in the amount of capital going into the ecosystem that's likely because of higher interest rates and lower public markets and the like, does it slow everybody down a touch? And I think the answer, it is likely to slow everybody down a touch. But unfortunately, I think it is not going to be the case that most venture firms, and therefore most venture capitalists, go back to saying, actually, the most important part of my job is being an extraordinary board member and partner to CEOs. I wish it were true.
Well, that's a trend that you and I can pick up another time.
Indeed, I would be happy to.
Greg Sands from Costanoa Ventures, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure.